Okay, this is the 11th Plague, chapters 21 through 25. And there are 11 questions. I'm going to go over the questions first. So number 1 is, why does Jenny draw? Number 2, for what did Stephen want to go back to the Green's house? 3, when Stephen went back to the Green's house, what did he realize? Number 4, what happened at Fort Leonard the night of the prank? Number 5, where did Marcus tell Stephen for him and Jenny to go? Number 6, why did Stephen smell smoke as he ran through the woods? 7, after saving Jenny from the burning barn, why did Stephen go back in it? Number 8, when Stephen awoke, what had happened outside? Number 9, who did Stephen see crossing the street towards the casino? 10, what news was Stephen told? And number 11, who came to lend a hand when Stephen was digging a grave? So those are our questions, and as I read, we're going to try to answer them. Chapter 21. When I woke, it was barely light out and freezing. Winter had finally arrived. Even in my sweater, flannel shirt, and jeans, I shivered as I pushed myself up on my elbows. Jenny was sitting on the floor of the barn, dressed in jeans and a black sweater, scribbling away on her sketch pad. Aren't you cold? She shrugged, focused on the paper in her lap, sketching, frowning, erasing, and starting over again. In the sunlight, her black eye from the day before looked even worse, and oil slicks spread of blue, black, and gray. I turned on my side and watched her, pulling the blanket up over my shoulder. What are you doing? Drawing, she said without looking up. What? You? Think you could make me taller? Jenny smiled. I turned on my back and rubbed the sleep out of my eyes. What do you do for them? The drawings. Do you sell them or trade them or something? So our first question was just answered. What does Jenny draw? Why does she draw? Oh yeah, I supply the entire town with moody line drawings. Seriously. I don't know. Violet found this set of drawing pencils somewhere and then gave them to me. Everything seems a little quieter when I draw. Nothing else manages it. If I didn't, I think a lot more people around here would be sporting black eyes. So she says, everything seems a little quieter when she draws. I look up and trace the dusty lines of the timber stretching across the ceiling, wishing I had something like that. Something that would still the nameless feeling that was growing inside of me like a storm cloud, like something just barely forgotten. Dad. It was the first night of my entire life that I had spent apart from him, and for what? I thought bitterly, memories of the night before swarming in, so I could run around having fun while he lay there alone in that house. What if our little prank made things even worse? I closed my eyes and saw a glint of gold shining in the dark. My grandfather's fist falling from the sky, alive or dead. He was still there, his voice still in my ear. Our survival was all on me, and what was I doing about it? I drew myself up out of the bed. What are you doing? Jenny asked as I slipped one boot on and hunted for the other. Hello, question here. I should be out looking for supplies, I said, making camp somewhere. Funny, it seemed like you were making camp here. My fingers froze on the strap of my backpack. I stood there stupidly, unable to move. It was like all the bones had tumbled out of my body. How could I make her understand? Talk to me, Stephen, Jenny said quietly. She was looking up at me over the edge of her pad, her eyes liquid and sharp at the same time. It was like she was always one step ahead of me. Grandpa had told me 100 times to keep quiet, to keep things to myself, but I couldn't anymore. I kept thinking about what I'm going to be. What? A white star crowned in gold fell, and I shook from its impact. Punished, I said. For what? Having fun? Being with me? Why would you think that? Jenny's pencil clattered to the floor as she charged across the room. She knocked me back onto the bed. She threw her legs over my chest, holding me down. Ginny. She took both my wrists in her callous hands, pinning me. Her hair fell down around us like a curtain, blocking out the rest of the world. No one is going to be punished for something as dumb as stampeding some pigs or wrestling with me. Not by God, not by anybody. Ginny, let me up. The world is not all on you, Ginny said, pushing me down, suddenly fierce. I know it feels that way, but it's not anymore. She dipped her head down and kissed me. Not for either of us, okay? Now say that the world isn't going to end if little Stevie Quinn had some fun. Ginny, say it. I mean, you did have fun blowing things up and kissing me last night, right? Fun wasn't the word, not even close. Suddenly, Grandpa and that flash of gold seemed far away. Say it, Ginny repeated, a whisper, her face inches from mine. The world isn't going to end. I watched her lips move and matched them carefully, symbol for symbol. Something about it felt secret and shameful, but I said it anyway. The world isn't going to end. Ginny's lips fell onto mine, and then we lay there gazing dreamily up at the high ceiling for I don't know how long. One of us would laugh, and then the other. For no reason we could put a name to. Thoughts entered my mind, and I said them, and they all seemed to make sense to her. The sun mounted steadily outside, filling the barn with an amber light. What time do you think it is? I asked. Are you saying time doesn't cease to have meaning when we're together? Seriously. I don't know, she said sleepily. A little after dawn, I guess. Why? I turned so our faces were just inches apart on separate pillows. I want to go back over to the Greens for a second, before anyone gets up. For what? To see Dad and get some books. Books? I paused. I said it without thinking. I knew the mocking that was in it. But what could I do? Some books Tuttle gave me. Ginny chuckled. He totally got to you with the save the world thing, didn't he? He did not. He did. You're going to help usher in a new golden age of mankind. I am not, I said, and then when her laughter faded, I don't know. I was mad when I left, so I didn't take them. But now, I guess, I just never had anything like that before. School and stuff, I mean. It's kind of cool knowing things other than how to avoid dying. No, I get that, she said, then added with a smirk. You're coming back, though, right? This isn't some clever little ploy. I laughed, struck for a second by the strange sound of it, how easy it felt when I was with her. Once I got myself together, I stood there at the edge of the bed, hands stuffed in my pockets. How does this work? Do I kiss her before I leave? Over and over again, I was falling into worlds I didn't know the rules for. So I'll see you later. Ginny rolled her eyes at my awkwardness. I took a last look at her, lying there in the half light, and then turned toward the door, knowing that if I didn't leave right away, I never would. I want to come with you when you go. I stopped in my tracks, inches from the door. When your dad is better, she said, I want to come. I was going to be subtle about it. At one point, I was even going to blackmail you, since I spied on you burying all that stuff of Violet's that night. But now I thought I'd just come out with it. Ginny rose up out of bed and moved toward me. Look like you saw last night, I'm kind of a tactical genius, right? And I know where all the good stuff in this town is, so I could help you pick up some salvage before we go. What do you think? So I just read why Stephen wanted to go back to the Greens house. So what's at the Greens house that he wants to see? And what does he want to get while he's there? Ginny's face was inches from mine, but I was too stunned to say anything. You don't want me to, she said flatly. It's not that. What, you don't think I can handle it? Ginny teased. I could destroy you in a heartbeat. I know. Don't worry, Stephen. It's not like I'm asking you to marry me or anything. No, I didn't. I just mean I struggled trying to come up with a reason. Her offer was so confusing. Why would you want to? Why? Because I can't live in this stupid 20th century museum anymore. I don't belong here, and neither do you. I want to be out there in the real world with you. Ginny, it's not. What? Easy? Safe? Yeah, no kidding. We were out there for 10 years before we came here, and we saw all the same things you did. Worse, maybe. I thought of that morning by the stream. She and Jackson playing cards and all the blood that followed. Who was I to tell her what the real world was? I know it will be dangerous, she said. I just think sitting here in this barn playing dumb pranks isn't living, with or without you. I'm leaving. I'd rather it be with you. And I think that's what you want too. She was right. I knew it as soon as she suggested it. I knew exactly what Grandpa would think and what he would say. But right then, I didn't care. The idea of walking out of town without her seemed impossible. Yeah, I said, yeah, okay. Ha, she exclaimed. Nice. It'll be great. You'll see. And your dad is totally going to love me, don't you think? Yeah, I kind of have a feeling he might. Jenny popped up on her toes and kissed me again, holding it longer this time, slipping her arms around my back so our bodies pressed tight together. Still want to get those books? I smiled. Our foreheads met, making a closed little pyramid. Yep. Jerk. I'll come back as soon as I get them. By the time I got to the door, Jenny already had her sketch pad in her hands, drawing it, lost in it. Her dark hair was a tangled mess, and in the growing light of the morning, her skin glowed. Her sweater slipped away from her shoulder, revealing a tiny island chain of freckles. I watched her for a second and then slipped out the door into the cold morning air. I stood for a moment in the barnyard, then made for a path that cut like an arrow into the woods. Everything seemed golden and crisp around me, and I felt I was close to touching something I had never seen or even hoped for. The future. Chapter 22. I avoided the main road, following the decaying perimeter fence as it wound through the woods before jumping it and heading towards Settler's Landing. My steps felt lighter than usual as I walked through the bare trees. It was funny trying to imagine Jenny out with me and Dad on the trail. Somehow I couldn't see her trudging along, donkey in tow, picking up scrap. Maybe we won't even go back to the trail. I stopped in the middle of the woods, surprised by the thought. I rolled it around in my head like it was a jewel I had just discovered. Was it possible? After all, Dad had been talking about it before the accident, and now, with Jenny along, maybe we really could make a new start. Settle somewhere. Go west and see what was to see. There was a whole world out there. I laughed a little to myself. The idea would have terrified me just weeks ago. How had that changed? Was it Jenny? Was it Settler's Landing? Did it even matter? Hope was hope, and I'd take it. I clambered down a hill and leapt over a stream. The trees opened up above me. The sky was thick with looming gray clouds. The way the temperature was dropping, I wondered if I might actually see snow this year. Usually we were down in Florida by this time of year, since real winter storms could sometimes last for weeks on end. The last time I'd seen snow was during a freak storm years before. We had just gotten to the Canadian camp in early April, when the days suddenly grew cold and snow began to fall. It had seemed like a miracle. The trading camp had buzzed around us, everyone rushing to celebrate before it was gone. There had been a bonfire and food roasting on spits and a three-man band whose music had floated above the camp. Mom and Dad and I stayed behind while Grandpa went out looking for tobacco. We'd gathered around our campfire in a semicircle of folding chairs, cooking a skinny chicken on a spit, a plastic tarp angled over us to keep the snow off. We knew from experience that several hours from that moment we would have to take refuge to escape the drunkenness and the fights that inevitably broke out after a big party. But that was later. Right then the air was full of laughter and music and the clean-smelling snow that had painted the muddy camp around us a fresh, brilliant white. I had The Lord of the Rings on my lap, but was listening to Dad talk about his days as a theater usher in San Diego, while Mom talked of wild party after wild party and teased him for being a nerd. So how did you guys meet? I asked that night. Mom had glanced at Dad. I was maybe 8 then, and they only recently started talking to me about the collapse and the war. Started up, Dad said. There were rumors about a quarantine in San Diego, so your grandparents and I piled into the car using Grandpa's military ID to get our blocks. We thought we'd head out east to this old army installation in the desert to wait things out. On our way out of town, we stopped for gas at the station your mom's parents owned. But then my whole family was gone, Mom said. My sister, Sarah, went first, then Dad, then Mom. Mom's face had darkened, remembering it. I heard the bell ding as your dad and the folks pulled up. I came out from behind the station to meet them. I was filthy. It's funny. I was such a prissy little thing when I was little, playing dolls and insisting everything I owned be as pink and frilly as possible. But by that point, I barely bothered to wipe the dirt off my face before going to fill up their gas. Dad held out his hand, stretching it across the space between them, and Mom had taken it. I pumped it for your grandpa, and when I was done, he dug down into his pocket to pay, but all he had was 100. When I told him I didn't have change for 100, he started yelling and screaming, claiming I was trying to cheat him. I laughed. I was like, the world is coming to an end, man. I mean, the sky is falling. I just buried my entire family out in the desert, and you're having an aneurysm over your $11.50 in change? Finally, I just said, forget it. Go with God, Ebenezer. So he took his 100 and jumped in the car. But by that point, your father here had gotten out of the car and said he wasn't getting in until his dad agreed to take me with them. Well, if you thought your grandfather had been impolite before, imagine the tidal wave of profanity that erupted when number one's son decided to stage a little coup. Your grandpa screamed and hollered. He stamped his feet, even hit him. Can you believe that? Hitting someone as adorable as your father. It didn't matter, though. Your dad was a brick wall. He wouldn't give an inch, not 1 inch. I hadn't said 2 words to him yet, and he was my noble man. Why'd you do it, Dad? Dad had locked eyes with Mom over the orange flames. The snow swirled behind him. I don't know, he said. Didn't really even think about doing it until then. It was just the second I saw her, it was like a jigsaw puzzle, you know? You've got all these pieces, and on its own, each piece is a splotch of blue or a bit of green. But then a bunch of them click into place, and you've got the sky or the grass, and the whole thing just makes sense. I'd recognize the look that came over his face then. He got it a lot when looking at Mom. It was like he was seeing her as she was right then, bright and rosy in the fire's glow, but at the same time, seeing her as she was on the day they met, and when they'd first kissed, and then they'd snuck away from Grandpa to be married, and then, as he imagined, she might be 10 years down the line, then 20, then 30, and finally, as the old woman he had no idea she would never have the chance to become. It was like he was looking at his whole life with her in that one moment. I stepped out into the tree line in the Greens' backyard. There were no candles lit in the windows, and I couldn't hear any sign of movement from inside. Still, I skirted around the edge of their backyard garden toward the front door. I knew they wouldn't mind my coming, but I thought it would be better if they didn't see me. Hiding behind the corner of the house, I peeked into the neighborhood. It seemed strangely quiet, empty, almost as if everyone who lived there had picked up and moved on the night before. I told myself it was just my imagination. I came out around the side of the house and went up to the front steps, letting myself inside. Dad lay in his usual place, looking exactly as he had the night before. His face, more and more drawn as the days passed, was still framed with his great swirls of black hair, shot through with veins of white. He'd become a different person the day he met Mom, like a switch had been flipped inside of him. He stood up to Grandpa in a way he had never done before, and then they somehow managed to hold on to each other as the world tore itself to shreds around them. They even had me when the idea of bringing another person into that wreck of a world must have seemed crazy at best. I thought maybe the man he was back in the plane, the one who rescued those two people, was the man Mom knew emerging again after being so long without her, the man who wouldn't admit that the world was really over. She would have been so proud of him. I realized, maybe for the first time, that I was too. Jenny wants to come with us when we go, I said quietly, my hand on his shoulder. I think you'll like her. I was thinking maybe we won't even go back on the trail, you know? Like you said before, we came here. Maybe we'll find someplace to have a house. Maybe we'll... I stopped myself short. It was fine when it was all in my head, but it felt foolish to imagine that life out loud. Driving back to sadness, I could feel swelling inside me. I knelt down by his bed and collected the books, piling them up in my arms. I'll be back soon, I said. I reached for the doorknob, but as I did, I noticed the coat track that hung on the wall next to the doorframe. Something about it struck me, but for a second, I didn't understand what or why. And then I got it. It was empty. Each time I had seen the Greens come inside, they would take off their jackets and hang them on the coat rack's pegs. If Jackson or Marcus ever forgot, Violet would ride him until they took it from wherever he dropped it and hang it up. The Greens should have been upstairs, maybe half an hour from getting up and starting their day. So why was the coat rack empty? I set my books on the floor and stepped into the kitchen, listening intently for any sound coming from upstairs. Nothing. From the bottom of the stairs, I could see Jackson's door hanging open in the hall. The stairs creaked as I made my way up, but there was no answering sound from any of the rooms. There were clothes scattered on Jackson's floor, and his bed was disheveled, like he had gotten up and dressed in a hurry. I made my way to the end of the hall, to Marcus and Violet's room, and found it the same way. So what? Something came up and they all decided to get an early start. It's nothing. It made sense, but I didn't believe it. Maybe it was that weird abandoned feeling I'd noticed as soon as I'd gotten to town this morning. I went downstairs and peeked out the front door. Just as I did, a door slammed shut somewhere across the park. A man ran from his house and then down the road that led to the school. I closed the Greens' door behind me and eased out onto the porch. I knew I should take my books and go back to Jenny. After all, what happened in this town was no longer my business. But, curious, I went down the road toward the school. I reached the edge of the parking lot just as the man threw open the school's front doors and disappeared inside. I circled around the side of the building, looking in each window as I had that first day, but saw nothing until I came around to the back of the school and looked in the window above the classroom. The room was packed, and what I was sure was every single resident in Settlers Landing was in there. 100 people or more. The desks and chairs were pushed aside, and everyone stood facing Tuttle's empty desk in tight groups. A murmur rose and fell in waves. I eased the window open. Violet and Jackson were at the front of the mob. Violet stood behind Jackson with her hands on his shoulders. His face was cast down, and his arms were tightly crossed over his chest. He leaned into his mom the way a scared child would. That was how everyone looked, afraid and waiting. The doors at the back of the classroom flew open and Tuttle came in, followed by Caleb and Will, and behind them Marcus. They all looked tired and pale. Their clothes were dirty and in some places torn. Each of them was armed. The crowd hushed instantly as Caleb swept in front of Tuttle's desk. He bowed his head, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Poison, Caleb said simply, letting it hang in the air without explanation. The people of Israel were beset on all sides by the godless animals, starving and hungry for destruction, unable to stand against the people of God in the field. They conspired to come into their land in the parties of 2 or 3 as spies. Caleb paused, searching the crowd. I pushed farther away from the window. The people of Israel took them to their heart. They dressed them in their clothes and gave them food and water and fellowship. After all, they thought, they were so few of them, what harm could there be? The people of God grew proud of their kindness and generosity, barely noticing the poison that had infected them, like a brackish stream pouring into a clear lake, until soon the water all around them was murky and foul. The people of God said to one another, "But where is our home? Where is the land of God that was?" This is how the weak and the profane destroy the strong and the righteous. The crowd held its breath as he scanned its faces. Last night our home was attacked. The crowd didn't move except for some parents who pulled their children tighter. 2 or more raiders from Fort Leonard, perhaps guided here by former members of our own community, came for our livestock, firing their weapons into the air to start a stampede. Whether their goal was to simply steal them or run them off in order to weaken us for a larger assault, we don't know. My family gave chase but was unable to overcome them. My first instinct was to laugh. It was so ridiculous. But the reaction from the crowd made it clear that this was deadly serious. Like you all, I know the danger of the world around us, Caleb continued, his voice softening, growing warm. How it presses against us every day. For years now we have been safe in our anonymity, blessed by God in this place, but I fear deeply, that such a time may be coming to an end. These new times will demand not only vigilance, but also action. It's my opinion we cannot sit idly waiting to be attacked again. If we are to truly be safe, we must act now before the danger grows. It gives me no pleasure to say this, but I propose the only course of action I feel is responsible. We must gather a force and as quickly as possible move the end of the threat of Fort Leonard once and for all. The people of Settlers Landing didn't hold back. Their agreement was absolute and automatic in a way that was frightening. Men yelled. Some stomped their feet and pounded on the walls. Down in the crowd, I saw Derek and Martin and Wendy and the rest of them with their parents, and all of them shouting their approval. Down in the front of the group, though, Jackson melted even further into Violet's body, his skin waxy and pale as he imagined. I was sure what was to come. Caleb soaked in their approval as Sam entered the room, a rifle slung over his shoulder. He looked haggard, his clothes in disarray, and salt and pepper growth of stubble on his ashen face. Marcus leaned in, nodding, as Sam whispered to him. The two then slipped out of the doors together, and I moved away from the window to follow them. I thought that if I had the chance to stop the madness, this was it. By the time I made it around to the parking lot, Sam and Marcus were talking to a small group of armed men. They spoke briefly, then Sam took the men east over the hill and out of sight. Marcus quickened his pace across the lot and toward town. Marcus, I cried. Marcus, wait. Marcus turned back. What are you doing here? You shouldn't be here, Stephen. It was us, I said, catching my breath. What? Me and Jenny at the Henrys last night. We didn't mean anything by it. It was just a stupid prank to get back at Will and them. Marcus checked behind us, then yanked me off the road toward the shelter of the trees. Someone said they were from Fort Leonard. That was me. It was dumb. I know. I'm sorry. Look, just tell Caleb. Tell him it was us. We'll go. We'll really leave this time. There's no reason to do what he's saying. Build an army? Marcus, that's insane. It's too late, Stephen. No, it's not. Go back in there and tell them. No, he barked, almost knocking me back. Caleb came out and got a group of us right after it happened last night, and we went out to Fort Leonard. Something sunk inside of me. What did you do? Marcus drew a shaky breath and then dropped his eyes to the ground between us. Marcus, what happened? We found their settlement early this morning, figured out one of the buildings with the food storehouse. Caleb had the idea we should raid it like we thought they'd done to us. It seemed simple. The whole town looked to be asleep, but there were 2 guards. They fired at us. Caleb shot one. I got the other. I jumped as the school doors boomed behind us and the crowd started pouring into the lot out front. Maybe we can talk to them, I said. Talk to Caleb. Explain. Maybe. The people at Fort Leonard were getting together before we even left, he said. It won't be long before they come looking for us. Our only chance now is to get them before they can get us. The rumble of the crowd grew louder as it reached the road. So it asks what happened at Fort Leonard the night of the prank. So what did Caleb and Marcus do? You should go too. Take Jenny and get out of here. Go to the old casino on the other side of the highway. So number 5 says, where does Marcus tell Stephen and Jenny to go? And the book says, you should go. Take Jenny and get out of here. Go to the old casino on the other side of the highway. We'll come and get you when things have calmed down. But Marcus, did you listen to that speech? He thinks you two were a part of it, Stephen, that you helped them. We tried to tell him you weren't any harm, but I don't know what he's going to do. Just go, Stephen. Get back to Jenny. Now. Marcus left to join the mob as it swarmed up the hill. I slipped into the woods and ran as fast as I could, throwing myself over the fence and dashing off again. Jenny had been alone for more than an hour. The trees rushed by me as I ran, leaping over rocks and brush. It was a little more than a mile out when I first smelled smoke. So number 6 says, why does Stephen smell smoke? The air thickened the closer I got, and my eyes stung, my heart pounded, and I ran until my legs burned. Ran until I blew through the trees and came into the clearing where I was faced with a wall of flame and gray smoke. Jenny's barn was on fire. Chapter 23. Jenny! I threw myself into the doors of the barn, scorching my hands and choking on a lungful of smoke. Jenny! Flames were spreading up the walls and tearing into the roof of the barn. I dropped low where the air was clear and covered my mouth and nose with my sleeve. My eyes stung, but I searched the barn, yelling her name as loud as I could. There was a flash of movement by the bed. I raced toward it, finding Jenny on the ground, coughing, her legs pinned under a pile of charred wood from the partially collapsed ceiling. She was trying to get out from under it, but was weak and barely able to move. I grabbed her under her arms and pulled, but she cried out. There was a whoosh as the wall next to us caught fire, exploding into a curtain of red and orange. The smoke swelled and thickened. I dropped to my knees around Jenny's waist and thrust my hands into the smoldering pile of wood, ignoring the feel of my fingers searing as I threw the timbers off. I shook Jenny by the shoulders, but by then she was unconscious. I looked all around me. The doors I'd come in had caught fire, as had the walls on every side. Fire flowed over the ceiling. I was trapped. The old wood barn, dry and weak from years of neglect, popped and hissed, burning as easily as paper. I rolled Jenny onto her back, then muscled her up over my shoulder. The ceiling groaned louder. There was no time to waste. I stood up, eyes watering and lungs aching, then dropped my head and shoulder and ran as fast as I could straight at one of the burning walls. There was a panicked instant when it resisted, but then the wood cracked and the flames gorged into my shoulder and cheek. Our momentum carried us out of the barn and into the tree line, where I stumbled and Jenny went spilling out into the brush. I collapsed, coughing and heaving beside her. Jenny moaned. Her one good eye was open, but barely. She was breathing. You're going to be okay, I said. We're going to be fine. I thought it was Will and them, she rasped, but it wasn't. It was a group of men. They didn't even say anything. They just, It's okay, I said. There was a crash behind us as part of another wall fell in. The relief of safety washed away, though, when I realized that everything we owned, my pack and supplies, Jenny's clothes, Grandpa's rifle, was all in the barn. We couldn't go back to Settler's Landing, and without shelter or supplies, and with the winter coming fast, we were dead. I could still make out a hole in the wall I had broken through, a splintering oval wreathed in the flame. Fire had spread nearly everywhere, but the deep breath before jumping through the gap, stumbling toward what was left of the bed. My lips were sealed tight, and my fingers pinched my nose closed. If I tried to take a breath, I was dead. I tripped over a pile of timbers and landed hard. The smoke had dropped almost to the level of the floor. I felt around wildly, squinting into the gray clouds until my fingers hit the side of my pack. I pulled it to me and threw it over my shoulder. My knife was in its sheath next to it. I stuffed it into my back pocket. There was a crack behind me and the sound of falling wood. I caught sight of the rifle lying next to Jenny's sketch pad, its barrel pointed toward me. I reached for it, but the red-hot metal singed my fingers, and I had to yank them back. There was a growl above me. The roof was coming down. I reached out again, and my fingers closed around Jenny's sketch pad. Scrambled to my feet and ran toward the opening in the wall. The growl above me turned into a long moan. There was a whoosh, and the wall behind me collapsed. Then the ceiling started to come down, forcing the smoke and heat on my shoulders like two giant hands. Burning wood fell at my heels, popping and hissing. The way before me was closing off. All I could see was gray and livid yellow. I thought of Jenny lying there all alone and threw myself into the air. Chapter 24. We stumbled through the woods, our arms clasped around each other, until we crossed the highway and came to the parking lot that surrounded the Golden Acorn Casino. When we got there, I eased Jenny down. The lobby was musty and cold, a jumble of gaming tables, chairs, and slot machines, most of which had been stripped of anything useful years ago, littered the main room. I followed a corridor that branched off to one side and was lined on either wall with rows of identical-looking doors. I pushed on each one until I found a door that gave. The room was empty except for a mattress that lay on a concrete floor, stripped of sheets and its metal frame, and the husk of what used to be a giant television set. It wasn't much. I pulled the curtains back and saw the big glass window on one wall was still intact. It would do. I brought Jenny inside the room and we collapsed on the bed, both of us covered in small burns and soot. Jenny's legs had gotten the worst of it. I pulled out my first aid kit and carefully cleaned and dressed her wounds. We'd have to keep an eye on them, but for now, they didn't look serious. Jenny patched me up, and then we drank the rest of the water in my canteen. After that, we were exhausted and lay down, our arms draped over each other. Soon, Jenny was asleep, but I lay awake for hours as the land outside the hotel room around us dropped into deeper and deeper darkness. For some reason, I kept seeing the quarry, me and Jackson surrounded by all his friends. My friends. I skipped back to earlier that day and felt the jolt as I connected with that ball and ran the bases. I felt the wind against my skin and heard the sound of those voices cheering me on. But all that was gone now, wasn't it? I looked over at Jenny, who was sleeping fitfully burned and slashed, and my nails dug into my palm. I grimaced at the pain but welcomed it, because it hadn't been me. I was the one who sent those people to Jenny's with torches in hand. If they had killed Jenny, it would have been my fault. If there was a war, it would be my war. The people at Settlers Landing were a bomb, but I was the one who lit the fuse. I rolled out of bed and drew the curtains aside. I thought of Dad lying all alone at the Greens and felt low and sick. If the war came to Settlers Landing, it would come for him too. They won't come here. I turned away from the window. Jenny was sitting up on the mattress watching me. Who? Will and his family. They won't follow us here. Why not? The square pegs are out of the round holes. They can do what they want now. I leaned against the windowsill. Do you think they'll really do it? Start a war? Jenny winced as she drew her burned legs up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them, her face filled with moonlight as she peered out the window. I think they want the world to be like it was when they were our age. Maybe a war is just the last piece of the puzzle. I left the window and pulled out my old bedroll, spreading it out as best I could. We sat up, huddled close together. Jenny laid her head on my shoulder. I shouldn't have gotten you involved, she said, in any of it. The fight with Will, the thing at the Henrys, it was stupid of me. You didn't know what would happen. I didn't care, Jenny said, a knife edge of bitterness in her voice. She turned and stared out the window, her back to me. Maybe I just wanted to get back at them and didn't care who got hurt in the process. I reached out until my hand found hers and clasped it tight. She turned. Her cheek was silver in the moonlight. Come on, she said. Let's get out of here. We left the casino and Jenny led me down to a billboard on the side of the road. It was the tallest one I'd ever seen and dwarfed the trees. We climbed up to the very top, up rusty vine-covered handholds, past the smiling tanned family that claimed AT&T cell phones would keep them connected forever, and sat looking at the miles of empty land. That night had turned cold with banks of heavy clouds rolling in. Jenny craned her long neck and looked at a field of stars that glittered in the black. If you looked close, it was almost as though you could see the stars moving, a sparkling dome, turning and turning. Used to be you couldn't even see them, Jenny said, with the cities and their lights and pollution and all. At least that's what Violet said. Jenny picked a leaf off of a nearby tree and let it drop, watching as it helicoptered down through the emptiness. Jenny leaned into me against the cold, and we sat and watched the moon. Far off in the distance, the barest wisp of smoke rose like a ribbon from someone's campfire. Do you ever wonder what they're doing out there? Who? All the other people, Jenny said. I mean, there's a whole world out there, right? Whole other countries. Who knows, maybe there's some place out there where the collapse never even happened, where people are just going about their lives. Was it possible? Since we shared a border, P11 hit Mexico and Canada as badly as it hit us. But what about everyone else? Were there places that the collapse never touched? I looked out into the night and wondered. If you could make it so it never happened, Jenny said, would you? I tried to imagine it, the collapse, the horror of P11. What would this place be like if none of it ever happened? I imagined vast crowds of people packed shoulder to shoulder, scurrying about like ants, our silent world wiped away by electric lights and movie theaters and televisions and cars. What would our lives be like? Jenny and I never would have met, for one thing. She would be thousands of miles away with a different name and a different family. And since my mom and dad only met because of the war, would I even have existed at all? I knew it was wrong not to wish the death away. But how could I long for a life, a world that I didn't even know? I don't know, I said. Jenny raised her lips to my ear. I wouldn't, she breathed. Later, we walked back to the casino and slipped into bed. As Jenny slept, I laid my head on her chest and listened to the thrum of her heart. It sounded like a bird's wings beating in the air. I opened my eyes hours later, fully awake, and stared up into the darkness. Jenny was on her side, breathing low and steadily. I dressed quietly and felt my way out of the room and down the hall to the brighter gaming area, navigating toward the front door. The edges around it seemed curiously bright for the hour. I stepped up to it. Outside, the whole world had changed. As we slept, the first snow of the year had fallen with a vengeance. It covered everything with a coat of white that was already inches thick. The snow fell lightly now with musical clink as one crystal stuck to another and settled. With the moon just visible through some cracks in the clouds, the whole place glowed almost as light as day. I buttoned up my coat and made my way out across the parking lot, my steps crunching and my breath a white plume trailing behind me. So, number 8, when Stephen awoke, what had happened outside? So, what's going on out there? I had no destination in mind, but I felt this pull to keep going, so I followed the highway for a while, then veered off to the trees. There, I found a circle of land isolated by the snow and the heavy canopy of tree limbs. I cleared a plot of ground, then knelt down and assembled a pile of brittle leaves and twigs for a fire. The movements Grandpa had showed me years before effortlessly flowed back. Soon a spark caught off the fire starter I had in my pocket, and the leaves smoldered. I leaned in close and blew on it gently until smoke puffed up and a bit of flame peeped out. This was a most delicate time. Get excited, add too much wood too fast, and the whole thing would be suffocated. Go too slow, and the flame would starve and die. I added thin twigs at first until the flames grew and could sustain themselves, then layered on thicker branches. I watched it burn, the warmth and familiarity of it flowing over me. We're better off now, Grandpa had said one night as we sat across the fire. He was shaping a tree branch in the trigger of a small game trap with his knife while Dad slept fitfully behind us. I was hugging my knees, my head down, my throat sore, exhausted from crying and wishing I could disappear. I was 10. 2 newly dug graves, one large, one small, throbbed in the darkness behind us. For months I had watched Mom's stomach grow, drunk with wonder. Dad had sat me down patiently, if awkwardly, explained exactly what was going on, but it meant nothing to me. Clearly, this little person, this little world growing inside her, couldn't be anything but a miracle. I tried to picture having a brother or sister, someone to talk to play with, to voice chores off of, to torture in more ways than I could imagine. It was too good to be true. What are we going to call it? I asked Mom one day. How about Frodo? We're not calling the baby Frodo. Why not? How about Agnes? Mom suggested. Boring, Dad piped up. Hildegard? Blah. Oh no. Dad hopped on his toes. If it's a boy, Elvis, Aaron, Presley. Grandpa, of course, was furious. It would be another mouth to feed. It would slow us down. He went on and on, but as tough as he was, Mom was tougher. She said if everybody thought like that, then the human race was going to disappear pretty fast. We had planned on being at the Northern Gathering when the baby came. Dad said there were women there who knew about these things, but we were a month's hike away at best when Mom gasped and grabbed her stomach and announced that it was time. But can't we stop it? I'd asked. Delay it or something? Nope. When it comes, it comes. Dad was trying to seem unconcerned, dashing around to make Mom more comfortable, but I could tell he was worried. Mom, too. Usually she joked through the worst of times. She always said that's what joking was for. But as she lay there on the grass that morning, her face was cut with lines of tension and sweat as she strained and cried out and fought. It was as though she was drowning and trying more and more desperately to claw her way to the surface of the churning water. Dad tried to help, and so did I, but it was no use. There was so much blood. 3 hours into her labor, Mom's cries stopped. Her face went slack. Bev? Dad knelt by her side. Bev? Her hand slipped from his, like a dove tumbling out of the sky. Late that night, after the graves had been dug and Dad was finally asleep, I sat alone with Grandpa around that fire as he whittled at a piece of wood from his old hunting knife. Learn from this, he croaked. Learn what? My voice sounded far away, like it was floating somewhere above my head. Grandpa glanced over his shoulder, where the skeleton frames of the roller coaster ride rose in the sky. He turned and spit thickly into the fire. He wasn't at all the stick figure he would become in just a few years. He was a twisted piece of metal, scarred and pitted and hard. His knife edge crew cut was thick and gray. Even in the light of the fire, his eyes were pale blue marbles, small and cold. She's better off now. Grandpa's ring glinted as he carved a bloodless gash in the wood and looked at me across the flames. We made a mess of things before you were born, he said. P11 was just what we deserved. It was no plague, it was a blessing. Surviving it, that's the real plague. But soon it'll just be silence. Now, as my own fire hissed and sputtered, I wondered, was he right? Is this how we were meant to live, like animals, living and dying and hoping for nothing until one day we all disappear? If we were, then what? Should I just go on my own? Right then? Violet probably hadn't retrieved her medicines yet. I could take them, get my pack while Jenny slept, and disappear. Dad would be safe in Violet's hands. Jenny would be fine on her own. Maybe if we all went our separate ways, if we stayed low to the ground, no towns, no family, no friends, this new end of the world would pass us by. Maybe then we'd all be safe. Maybe Grandpa's only mistake was that in keeping us together, he hadn't taken things far enough. The wind surged, blowing the drifts of the ground and the low-hanging tree branches, whiting out everything around me, erasing it. I thought of Jenny lying there in that dark room, curled around the spot where I had been, a warm place in all that cold. I knew that leaving right then might spare us pain later, but I also knew that I was fooling myself if I thought I could do it. This was a chain that ran from me to her. I didn't know when or how it came to be, but it was there. I could feel it. I didn't want to imagine what she'd be like in 5 or 10 or 20 years. I wanted to see it. I wanted to be there. Besides, in the end, who had Grandpa's rules ever saved? Not Mom, not Dad, not even himself. If it was true that all paths in the world led to only one place, then why not fill whatever path you choose with the best things you can find? I wasn't my grandfather. I never would be. I turned to go back to the casino, but before I took a single step, a dark figure crossed the highway in front of me and moved quickly toward the building, leaning in against the wind. I couldn't make out who it was, but it didn't matter. Jenny was alone in there. My boots crunched through the snow as I raced back, wishing Grandpa's rifle hadn't been lost in the fire. I gripped the hilt of Dad's knife. Instead, it would have to do. The figure in a black coat with the hood turned up was at the door when I got there, ready to go in. Stop! I gripped the knife tight, ready to use it. The figure in black turned to face me and lifted the hood. Violet? She stepped into the white between us. Stephen, she said, moving toward me. Thank God. Are you okay? Is Jenny? I didn't know what they were going to do when I found out. We're fine. Violet said nothing for a moment. The snow surged, making her body wavier, ghost-like and gray. What is it, Violet? A plane of snow drifted between us as she looked back in the direction of Settler's Landing. He's gone, she said. I came to tell you he's gone. What? Who's gone, Violet? What are you? But then I knew. So what did she tell Stephen? What had happened? Chapter 25. I stepped out onto the green's porch hours later. It was late, and everyone was asleep. The snow had finally stopped. I held a lantern I had found down at the green's basement. The land around me glowed in a dazzling white. The roads were gone. The playground had disintegrated into a few ice-covered bars and odd-shaped mounds of snow. The lines that divided one yard from the next had been wiped clean. I descended the steps and started south. The houses to either side of me were a little more than snow-covered cliff faces. Walking through them was like walking along the bottom of a deep canyon. It wasn't hard to carry him. As with Grandpa, death had taken Dad a bit of time until there was almost nothing left. I passed the entrance of the town, the wall now just a long ridge, like a curving collarbone, bleached white in the sun. I crossed the lawn beyond the wall, then passed through the trees and out again until I came to the great empty plain on the other side. The world had disappeared. There was nothing but white as far as I could see. The casino and the Starbucks were snowy hillocks. Even the towering billboards to the north had been nearly erased. I walked out into the nothingness until my legs stopped moving. Then I sat the lantern down and eased Dad onto a snowbank. As I did it, the sheet covering his face fell away. The crow black of his hair and beard was startling. Lying in the middle of all that white, His mouth was slightly open and his skin was a bluish gray. He looked so small, shrunken, and old. People said that the dead looked like they were only sleeping, but it had never seemed that way to me. To me, there was nothing there at all, an empty house, an abandoned world. I covered his face with a sheet and picked up the shovel. Moving the snow aside was easy enough, but when the blade of the shovel hit the ground, it rang like a bell. My palms ached from the vibration. The ground was nearly frozen. I had changed back into my old clothes before leaving the greens, so when I pulled off my coat, the icy wind tore through my sweater and patchwork pants. I wedged the shovel into a crack in the ground, then leaned my weight into it, pushing the blade an inch or two farther break the icy shell. Once I had done that across the entire breadth of the grave, I was able to dig the shovel in farther and remove the dark soil inches at a time. As I got lower, the dirt became looser. The blade of the shovel scraped across the rock as it tore into the soil. Hours later, my muscles were burning and my chest was heaving. Each time I drew breath, the frigid air tore at my lungs. I couldn't feel my hands or feet. The skin of my ears stung. My body was slick with sweat despite the cold. I stopped digging. Hanging over the shovel's handle, exhausted, I caught my breath and then checked my progress. I was standing only about 2 feet deep in the ground. The shovel fell out of my hands. I dropped back into the snow like a rag doll. The cold reached up into my back, spread through my chest, and curled its fingers around my heart. Stephen? Jenny stood beside me, our blanket wrapped around her shoulders. When I didn't say anything, she reached for the shovel, but I yanked it away from her and held it to my chest. I have to do this myself. Jenny stared at me, her hair whipping past her reddened cheeks. No, you don't. I ignored her, using the shovel like a crutch. I got back to my feet. I raised the handle painfully over my head and dug down another foot before faltering again and collapsing into a heap. I forced myself up and began again. When I was finally done, I sat at the foot of the open grave and pulled Dad to me, wrapping my arms around his thin chest. I closed my eyes and could see his face as it was lit from the inside as he held up that first slice of pear in the darkness of a dead plain. Then the iron look that came over him when he decided he was going to be a hero for the first time since Mom left us. I heard his booming laugh and his shuddering sobs as he sat by his father's grave, and Mom and the daughters he would never know. I felt his chest rise and fall alongside mine, his breath like the dry turning of the pages in a book. All of that had come to this. Stillness. A yawning silence. Like none of those things had ever been. Jenny helped me lower him down until the white glow of his shroud disappeared in the darkness at the bottom of the grave. He looked like a child curled up and helpless, alone. I reached into my back pocket and found the sharp edge of our family photograph. I raised it up onto the dim moonlight, tracing the lines of me and Mom and Dad smiling together for one of the last times before holding it over the grave and dropping it in. It fluttered like a leaf and settled onto his chest. I stood there for some time, feeling the pull of the grave, like a cold arm wrapping itself around my shoulders and drawing me down with him. I took the shovel and filled the hole. When it was done, I stumbled and fell back onto the ground. A new swirl of snow appeared out of the gray lightning sky. It seemed like the body of a great white bear tumbling down onto me, its claws outstretched. I shut my eyes and let it have me. Who came to help Stephen dig the grave? It's your last question.